There have been far darker moments in human history. There really have been. I mean, I know society can sometimes seem a bit shit at the moment because we're ruled by people who either don't know what they're doing or do know what they're doing, and what they're doing is awful. So it can feel dispiriting, and I know a lot of people do feel dispirited, but there have been far darker moments in history. The midnight in the century of the Holocaust, for example, that was far worse than what we have now.
You're watching Deconstructive Criticism. I am Aaron Flam. In this episode, I once again sit down with Brendan O'Neill, Spiked Online's chief political writer, to confront the disturbing truths laid bare in his latest book, After the Pogrom. Subtitle, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. It's a blistering critique of a world that seems increasingly willing to excuse violence, downplay atrocities, and compromise its own values. In his analysis, Brendan reveals how Western societies are failing the fundamental moral test, facing a crisis that reaches to the very core of our civilization. Join us in tackling the raw and uncomfortable realities that too many prefer to ignore. If you care about the survival of reason, humanity, and moral courage, it's a conversation you won't want to miss. Brendan O'Neill, enjoy. Welcome back to Deconstructive Criticism, Brendan O'Neill. It's a pleasure to have you back.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
So, since I have you for such a short time, your schedule is getting more pressing with each year. I know you. I might as well start. Either we talk about what you want to talk about from now on, or I delve into a meat and bones kind of question, which might take us in a strange direction. So
let's do that one. Yeah.
All right. So October 7th, is it the best argument for the State of Israel, or is it the best argument against the State of Israel?
Definitely, I would say the former. It's one of the points I make in my new book, which we can come on to, is that nothing better proves the necessity of Israel than the fact that so many people want to destroy it. And there is no better argument for Zionism than the fact that so many people loathe Zionism, because that is proof of why it's necessary. When you are surrounded by armies of anti-Semites who want to kill your people and destroy your state, as Israel is, and when you're under siege from the so-called intellectuals of the West, who have become unhealthily obsessed with the Jewish state, then the Jewish state needs to continue existing. It needs to continue to fortify itself against these regressive elements, both at home and abroad, and create a homeland for its people. And that's what it's doing, and that's what it ought to continue doing.
But wouldn't the counter-argument be, if there wasn't a State of Israel, there would have been no October 7th?
Yeah, but then one could easily say that if there hadn't been Jewish people, then there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. You can't.
It would have made it more of a challenge.
It would have made it much more of a challenge. They would have had to focus on some of the other minority groups a lot more. You can't say that just because Israel is provoking people, and it does provoke people. It provokes Hamas and Hezbollah because they are anti-Semitic organizations who hate Jews and hate the Jewish homeland. It provokes the woke of the West because they see Israel as the embodiment of all the transgressions of modern society. They see it as white supremacist, as a settler colonial nation, as genocidal. They project the sins of the West onto Israel. So Israel is a provocative nation, not necessarily because of what it does. I think its wars are relatively normal wars. I simply don't accept the idea that they are genocidal wars. So it's not because of what it does, but because of what it is seen to represent. It is seen to represent by Hamas and Hezbollah an inappropriate Jewish imposition in what they consider to be an Arab land. So it's seen as provocative by them. And by the Western haters of Israel, it is seen to represent Western ideals and modern ideals and the idea of nationhood and the idea of being a modern country that is confident, that wants to defend itself. They project all the things they loathe about the West onto Israel, and they turn it into the whipping boy of Western society. So it's a provocative state by accident, but that's no justification ever for it to be attacked.
So this mass projection, you could call it that, right?
Yeah.
Mass projection. I'm not a psychologist, but where do you think it comes from?
I've been thinking about this for a long time. I think it's been developing for quite some time, because if you go back to the 60s, if you go back to the 1967 war, and even the Yom Kippur War, 1973, a lot of Western leftists supported Israel. They thought Israel was the plucky new nation born from the horrors of the Holocaust, full of, a lot of young people who were willing to fight for their right to self-determination. It was seen as a very positive nation, an inspiring nation, and one that leftists and liberals should support. The Arab armies, in contrast, were seen as invaders. They were intruding on this Jewish homeland and doing things they shouldn't have been doing. So it was completely the reverse of what it is today. There's that famous photo of Leonard Cohen singing songs with the IDF during the Yom Kippur War. It was seen as, a nice cause, a sexy cause, a cause that the countercultural types would align themselves with. Over time, for some reason, it really starts in the 70s, I guess. But it when the Palestinian struggle, as it was called, came to be, bit by bit, it came to be seen as more attractive. And, you have Western German radicals wearing the keffiyeh and the Baader-Meinhof gang hanging out with the Palestinian militants and training with them and all this kind of...
And the IRA.
And the IRA.
Don't forget about the IRA.
Yeah,
Brendan.
all this mingling between Western radicals and the Palestinian movements. And I think what happened is that as the left in the West lost faith in their own societies, and particularly in their own working classes, who they came to be seen as increasingly disappointing. They were not rising up in the way that the left wanted them to, and the left started to view them as brainwashed by tabloid newspapers, a bit dumb, low information. All those ideas start to take form in the 70s and the 80s. The left becomes incredibly disappointed with working class people in the West. And so it looks for other causes to attach itself to. It looks for something that it thinks of as romantic and exotic. And that's exactly the role that the Palestinian movements played. And if you read some of the memoirs of the leading leftists of the 80s and 70s and the 80s and the 90s, they often talk about Palestine in that way. They will often say, they were depressed with all the boring politics at home in London or Stockholm or New York City, where it was, you could never really get anything done. But then suddenly there was this attractive movement of all these young militants, right? And they were
hijacking airplanes.
Yeah, and they wore the keffiyeh and they looked so cool, and they were not white, or it was this really kind of neo-racial treatment of the Palestinians as the noble savages. The people who might inject a bit of momentum into the lives of these bored white Westerners. That's really how it starts to take form. And over time, as a consequence of that, or alongside that, Israel starts to be seen as the evil force. Israel starts to be seen as the most oppressive state in the world, the worst state in the world. And recently, in fact, the writer for The Guardian referred to Israel's war in Gaza, or its war on Hamas, as uniquely murderous. So one of the most murderous campaigns in history, which is obviously completely and utterly untrue by any measure whatsoever. But it's indicative of this treatment of Israel as a uniquely barbarous nation, a uniquely deceitful nation. So I think what happened over time is the Palestinian cause came to be seen as very attractive for people in the West who felt lost, and they needed something to hate. And of course, that was Israel, which came to be seen as a demonic force in global affairs.
Yes, I think it's mostly envy and a bit intellectual laziness. I do.
Well, there's a lot of intellectual laziness, and there's a lot of lying. And people just say things about Israel that are just not true. People often say to me, how do we challenge the arguments about Israel? The arguments you hear on the streets, on social media, on college campuses. I mean, some of them are quite easy to challenge. They call Israel a white privileged nation, a white supremacist nation. It's not true. A small majority in Israel are actually not white. A majority of people there are Jews of Arab heritage, who got kicked out of the countries they lived in. No one wants to talk about that. People say it's a settler colonial nation. It's not a settler colonial nation. Israel, in its modern form, was born out of a fairly typical anti-colonial movement against the British Empire, against the British Mandate, as it was then called. And it set up its own nation through that process, as did many other new nations in the post-war period.
So let's talk about Britain for a second.
Oh, yeah.
Because they've just embargoed Israel, haven't they?
Well, Britain is taking lots of measures. The new Labour government is taking lots of measures against Israel that I find incredibly worrying.
And the name of your new foreign minister is David Lammy.
David Lammy.
Lammy.
He's a bit of an idiot. And you know what they've done? They've imposed arms embargoes to a certain extent. So they've withdrawn the licenses for, I don't know, it's like 20% of stuff that we send to Israel. They've now taken the licenses away. So we're still giving Israel a lot of things and we're still giving it assistance. But there's this symbolic gesture, a kind of slap on the wrist by, you know, the old rulers of the Middle East, Britain, which still sees itself as having the moral authority to boss around the Jews of the Middle East. I don't know where it gets that idea from. But, you know, people say, oh, it's just the left in Britain are not happy with it because they want Israel to be destroyed. So anything short of that leaves them very upset. So they're not happy with what Britain has done because they don't think it goes far enough. My view is that I agree it's a largely symbolic gesture. Britain doesn't have the same weight in international affairs that it used to have. But I still think it is incredibly important that Britain, which is supposed to be an ally of Israel, is taking action to remove certain forms of arms exports to Israel at a time when Israel is under constant attack from deranged armies of psychotic anti-Semites. For Britain to do that, I think, is the height of moral irresponsibility and is actually unforgivable. And it's inflamed the arguments made by the people on the streets of London, which is that we must disarm Israel. Because what these people are calling for, and they're doing it here as well in Sweden, they want Israel to be disarmed. What that means is they want Israel to be open to attack. And if you boil it right down, where they essentially say Israel shouldn't have responded in the way that it did to 7th of October. In other words, it should have just taken it on the chin. What's the big deal? 1,200 dead Jews. It's not the end of the world. That's essentially what they were saying. Now they're saying take away its guns, take away its weapons, take away its fighter planes. Boil it down, and they're saying Jews should let themselves be killed.
Yes.
It doesn't really matter. That's what they're saying. Now, to some of us, it does matter. It matters a great deal. And that's why we support the right of Israel to fight back against these marauding armies that surround it. So I find the message of these people on the streets incredibly sinister. And the fact that the Labour Party has taken this action that has flattered that message and has inflamed it and has made people say, go further, take away everything. That's really worrying.
Because looking out over Kattegat towards England from where I am, which is not entirely correct. I should just point out I'm on the east coast of Sweden, so I can't look out over Kattegat. But this summer's riots and everything that's been going on, have you collectively decided as a nation to commit national seppuku? Or is it something else going on?
Well, Britain is in trouble. Britain is a bit lost at the moment. I'm not a fatalist. I'm not an apocalyptic person. So I don't like these arguments. I don't like the idea that the West is fucked. Excuse my language, but that's what people say. And people will often say London is a lost city. It's not what it was, and it's fallen to foreign people. I don't buy that. London is still a great...
Fucking Romans, eh?
Yeah, exactly. London is still a great city. In my view, it's the best city in the world. It's a mix of different peoples. It's a mix of different cultures. There are a lot of problems there. And it does sometimes feel very disjointed and very divided. There isn't a common sense of being a Londoner in the way that there might have been in the past and in the way that there still is in a city like New York. In New York, everyone is a New Yorker, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. So London has lost some of that. There's no doubt about it. There are problems, but I don't like this idea that it's just going to hell and there's nothing we can do about it. Having said that, having kind of caveated it, that I don't think Britain is a lost cause, we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of problems to do with divided communities, people tending to live in their own ethnic or cultural bubbles, not engaging with the mainstream in the way that you might hope they would. And I think that's a function of the ideology of multiculturalism, which is a very dangerous ideology, not because I think it's impossible for people of different backgrounds to live together. I don't think that at all. It's very possible for people to live together. But because what the ideology of multiculturalism does, that it instructs people to be wary of British society itself. It constantly sends this message: Britain is an Islamophobic society. It's a racist society. It's a society born from the crimes of colonialism and empire, and it's got all these sins bearing down on it, and we should probably tear down those statues, and we should probably self-flagellate for the rest of time. The British elites have a very profound culture of self-loathing, and that impacts on how communities see the country in which they live. Who would want to integrate into an institutionally racist country? You just arrived in a country, and every message you get from popular culture, from the media, from the political class, from the cultural movers and shakers, every message says this country is a bit of a shithole. We're not nice people. We were the most evil empire that ever existed. You're not going to want to throw your lot in with that country. You're going to be held back from doing that. So we have this dual situation at the moment where we have record levels of immigration at a time when we don't know what we are for or who we are or why on earth anyone would want to come here and integrate. So we're inviting in more people than ever, but we're telling them, don't integrate, don't assimilate. There's nothing here to assimilate to. So that creates this extraordinary tension in society where there are now significant numbers of people who feel alienated from the country they live in, and in fact feel hostile to the country they live in, and that creates lots of problems.
Yes, I have noticed since quite a while now. And the BBC, how are they doing covering the war in Gaza?
The BBC just gets worse and worse.
I told you last time, abolish it.
I mean, I don't know if we need to abolish it, but we definitely need to rethink the license fee, because we are compelled by law to pay for this.
Yes, and we are involuntarily paying through our taxes for our state television.
So the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war has been terrible. They infamously refused for a period of time to refer to Hamas as terrorists.
Yes.
They said it's not our policy to refer to terrorists. We let viewers make up their own minds. They said this in a statement. That's bollocks. They use the word terrorism all the time. They published pieces recently saying, are incels a new form of far-right terrorism? You know, those loser virgins in their mum's
And Israel
basement.
Is obviously a terror state.
Right,
so,
yeah.
Yes.
And they use the word terrorism about far-right movements. They've used the word terrorism a lot in recent years. And yet when it came to Hamas, when it came to this army that went into Israel and killed 1,200 mostly Jewish people, they suddenly stopped using that word. And they said, we don't make those kinds of moral judgments. It's not true. And also, if you can't make a judgment on an issue like 7th of October, then you're even more lost than we thought you were. But the coverage since then has been awful. Firstly, the BBC is obsessed with Israel to the detriment of every other issue on the planet. People in Britain are so ill-informed about the world because they're not being told about any other conflict or any other global issue. Israel is, when you watch the news at 10 on the BBC every evening on BBC One, it's Israel almost every single day. Nothing else is talked about. And then the way they talk about it, they produce these completely context-free, emotionalist snippets of horror from Gaza. They don't give you any political context, any conflict context. It's just, look at these dead people. Look at this screaming woman. Look at this horror. It's the pornography of death. And it's designed to be morally titillating. It's designed to make the viewer feel pity and sorrow and horror.
And anger.
And anger and hate. And, there's a thin line between pity and hate.
I think they're building up to a form of, if we look at it as mass projection, they're building up to a sort of a sacrificial scapegoating ritual.
Well, yeah.
In which they need to feed their victim with the accusations of their own sins. to transfer their sins to the sacrificial goat, as it is in this case Israel, and then get rid of it. And if you don't succeed in killing the goat, if it fights back, then all this anger and hate just keeps building up inside. So I think we're quite lost, in my view. And also I think anti-Semitism. And so how about this? The West is going to hell, Brendan. But of course, one can fix it. There's no societies in the history of humankind that has had better, should we say, a better starting point for fixing an ailing society than Western societies. I mean, we have warm and cold water. We can wash our clothes. It's all fine, right? Good. So, but we don't have insight into our own disease, it seems. And I think our leaders have sold us out quite some. But if we, fix the ailments of our own societies, then probably anti-Semitism will go down, because it's a symptom of our ailing societies. And it's not that it's going away, it's just that when times are good, when things are peaceful and prosperous, people don't care as much about killing Jews.
Yes. The reason anti-Semitism is such a distinctive form of racial hatred is because it's always indicative that a society has lost its way. It's, that's when anti-Semitism comes back. It comes back when society has turned against reason, turned against its own values, and turned against the virtues of civilization, and has gone into a dark place.
Paganism.
Yeah, and you can look at that through history. Whenever there has been outbursts of anti-Semitic hysteria, as there have been many, many times in the medieval era, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, right through, of course, to the 30s and the 40s, it always accompanies a dark anti-enlightenment moment, a kind of turn away from reason, the light of reason, towards the darkness of something else. And anti-Semitism is often an expression of that, a facilitator of that, or it goes alongside that. And I think we're seeing that now today. The problem we have today, of course, is that all these, I'm increasingly of the view that a lot of the hatred for Israel is just anti-Semitism. But if you said that to these protesters on the streets, or if you went to Columbia University in New York or Leeds University in England, where there have been lots of protests against Zionism, and you said, you're all anti-Semites, you are all the white supremacists that you've been telling us to panic about for the past 20 years. That's you. You told that to them, they wouldn't understand, because they genuinely think of themselves as progressive and anti-racist and good people. But their obsession with Zionism is, I increasingly feel, just a form of racism, because this is the only idea of nationhood that they want to destroy. They never talk about destroying Turkish statehood, for example.
And they do want a Palestinian state.
And they want a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. So they want to erase Israel and get rid of the Jews. But then it crosses the line into open expressions of anti-Semitism. So at Columbia University, there was a placard at their Gaza encampment that described Israel as the pigs of the earth. Now, you can call that anti-Zionism as much as you want. That's anti-Semitism. There were kids at Columbia who told Jews to fuck off back to Poland. Why did they pick Poland? It's not a coincidence. It's because Poland is where most Jews died in the 40s. There was one incident at Columbia where a young protester in a keffiyeh was holding a sign up with an arrow pointing at a group of Jewish students. And on the sign, it said, "These are Hamas's next targets." So what you have here are students who've spent the past 10 years or so panicking about cultural appropriation and hiding in safe spaces because Ben Shapiro turns up to give a speech, and acting like the worst weaklings in history, complete snowflakes, as they were referred to, hiding away from anything that's offensive. And now they're openly wishing for the death of Jews. Now they're openly saying, you Jews will be the next targets of Hamas. Now they're openly saying, go back to Poland, whereas racists in the 70s would say, go back to Africa.
Globalized the Intifada.
And globalize the Intifada. And they chanted, globalize the Intifada, the day after an Intifada that involved the murder of 1,200 Jews. And the Intifada has been globalized. So when you look at the attacks on synagogues, which have happened across Europe, when you look at the graffiti at Jewish cemeteries, or when you look at the attacks on Jewish people, which we've seen across Europe and America, anti-Semitism has skyrocketed since 7th of October. That is the globalization of the Intifada.
Just a week ago, a Jewish man leaving shul was shot in the shoulder in Chicago by a man who shouted Allahu Akbar.
That is
probably a right-winger of some kind.
Yeah, that's the continuation of the pogrom.
Yes.
And, when I first saw the rise of this anti-Semitism and people on the streets celebrating 7th of October, and I remind people in my book that on the 9th of October, people gathered outside the Israeli embassy in London. When Israel hadn't really done anything meaningful by that stage. It certainly hadn't invaded Gaza. That didn't come until the end of October. And they were playing pop music. They were dancing. They were waving the Palestine flag. They were laughing. This was a pro-pogrom celebration. This was a celebration of the murder of Jews on the streets of London in 2023. If people had come out to celebrate Kristallnacht, we would remember that. So we have to remember that they did it for the 7th of October. And so again and again over the past year, you see this obsession with Zionism as the most evil thing in the world, this obsession with the alleged bloodthirstiness of Israel, the obsession with the idea that Israel loves to kill children. People refer to its war on Hamas as a war on children. This is all a rehabilitation of anti-Semitism. What people used to say about the Jewish people, they now say about the Jewish nation.
Yes, and it's also a projection, because who are the ones that kill their children and raise their children to be martyrs? It's the other side, isn't it?
It's,
which side is the side that practices apartheid in their countries and in their territories? It's Palestinians and Arabs, right?
It's, the thing about, the thing that really shocked...
Who wants to commit genocide?
Hamas does.
Yes.
Well, the thing that has shocked me over the past year has been precisely this moral inversion. So all the crimes that have been committed against Israel since 7th of October and since 7th of October are then pinned on Israel. So what happened on the 7th of October is that an army that has a genocidal ideology, I don't think it's capable of carrying out genocide, thank God, but it has a genocidal ideology which commits it to the erasure of Israel and the destruction of the Jewish state. That's a genocidal ideology. Israel was attacked by a genocidal group. 1,200 of its people were slaughtered, targeted because they were civilians, because they were women, because they were children, because they were Jews. So it was a racist attack. It was a genocidal attack. And then it's Israel that's accused of being genocidal when it responds. It's Israel that's accused of being racist when it responds to the worst act of racist violence of modern times. It's Israel that's accused of being of targeting civilians, even though reasoned people know that Israel only wants to kill Hamas militants, and civilians tragically die in all wars. So all the things that Hamas did, which was to directly target civilians, to have this genocidal desire to destroy people and a country, and to carry out its acts from the point of view of a very racist outlook, all of that is said about Israel. It's complete moral inversion. It's the world turned upside down. And the fact that there are so many young people in particular in our societies, and I mean millions of young people across the Western world, who accept this moral inversion, who never criticize it, who actually give voice to it on the streets of our cities every weekend, that is incredibly worrying. It suggests a collapse in critical thinking and a demise of moral reason.
Yes, it truly does. They are unable to tell good from bad, right from wrong. And I guess they can't tell if someone's evil.
It's, I probably would have been reluctant to use a word like evil a few years ago. I'm not a particularly religious person. I'm not a religious person at all. I used to be when I was a kid. But I do think Hamas is evil. I do think it's legitimate to describe them in that way. I think it's legitimate to describe them as a menacing force, not only for the Jewish state, but for the world itself. And the fact that so many in the West have essentially taken the side of Hamas. I mean, some have explicitly taken the side of Hamas. And in London, we saw people marching through the streets with green bandanas on. to mimic the Hamas bandana.
Yes, but remember the last time we talked on tape. We talked and we compared our country's reaction to terrorism. You talked about the Manchester bombing. I talked about what happened here at one of our larger thoroughfares, Drottninggatan, a few years back. We both our sort of states had concerts. You sang "Don't Look Back in Anger." We had some other person singing a Swedish song that amounts to the same thing, like "Better to Forgive and Forget." So when they turn to Israel and say, take it on the chin, the Western countries, maybe they just want Israel to join this suicidal death cult of that the West has turned into.
Yes, there's an element of that, because I think there has been a great reluctance in Western society over the past 10 years or more to talk about the problem of radical Islamism. No one wants to talk about it. In fact, you're discouraged from talking about it. There's a real culture of amnesia around terrorist attacks. People remember the Manchester Arena bombing, of course, because it was so huge. 22 people killed, mainly young people, including children. So people remember that, but people don't talk about it. They never talk about it in Britain. Even on the anniversary, it's very hushed. No one really commemorates it. And in fact, I went to see Morrissey in concert a couple of years ago, and he made this really good point from the stage, because he's got an album called Bonfire of the Teenagers, and Bonfire of the Teenagers is his reference to the Manchester Arena bombing. And he's very angry about the Manchester Arena bombing. He comes from Manchester, and he made this point to the audience. He said to us, how comes you all know the names Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, who of course were the Moors murderers who killed 6 children in Manchester in the 1960s? How comes you all know their name, but I bet you none of you know the name of the Manchester Arena bombing, who killed 22 young people in Manchester in 2017? And the audience was just stunned, because none of them could name the Manchester Arena bombing. I bet you could go through the streets of Britain and ask 100 people, and maybe 5, 6, 7 would be able to name him. His name is Salman Abedi. He was of Libyan heritage. He became radicalized, and he killed 22 people. And we don't talk about it. And if you do talk about it, you're accused of being Islamophobic or obsessed, or why are you stirring things up? Why don't you just get on with, why are you focusing on this bad stuff? So there's a real culture of amnesia around terrorism in the West. But with the 7th of October, it was worse, because not only did people say to Israel, take it on the chin, it's a normal part of life to lose 1,200 people, whatever. They also celebrated the attack. They supported it. I don't just mean the people who actually danced on the streets of London. I also mean more mainstream voices who essentially said, well, what did Israel expect?
Like the BBC, or the Swedish public broadcasting.
It's the undertone of all of this. The undertone of all of this is that the undertone of all the stuff that depicts Israel as a uniquely barbarous, uniquely deceitful nation, uniquely oppressive of the Palestinian people, the undertone of all of it, and sometimes it's the overtone, is that 7th of October kind of makes sense. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, the Black American writer, he essentially made this point recently, where he was on a podcast with Trevor Noah, and he said that if he was a 20-year-old in Gaza and he'd seen oppression and had seen whatever, he might have joined 7th of October.
Oh, I'm sure he would have.
And so
because he seemed quite weak-minded.
Well, yeah. So
kind of a peer pressure victim.
But the fact that someone like him could have that kind of thought experiment is so extraordinary, because this is a man who has written for the past 10 years or so in a very pontificating fashion about the war on the black body and how America is just an inherently racist society. And he uses all these weird examples of racial discrimination he's encountered, like a white woman was rude to him on an escalator and all this kind of, insignificant stuff in the scheme of things. He's talked about that for years and years. And now he's having a thought experiment about whether or not, in different circumstances, he would have joined the worst act of racist violence of the 21st century.
And partaken in rape and torture.
And partaken in a literal pogrom of the kind we haven't seen since the 1945, maybe 1946, because there was some stuff afterwards. Would he take part in it? So it's like it's extraordinary, and we have to trace how that journey, I think, from these Western activists and ideologues and the woke elites, for want of a better phrase, who have spent the past 20 years posing as implacably anti-racist and anti-fascist and progressive. And yet, when one of the most regressive armies in the world carried out an explicitly racist and fascistic attack, they essentially took its side. That is something that requires serious analysis.
Yes, well, I think I've done that for a few years. It's rather simple from where I'm sitting. Socialists and Islamists have joined forces to crush the West.
Well, there is a real problem with, in France, they call it the Islamo left.
Yes.
And that's been taking shape for some time.
Since 1947 in France's case.
Yeah.
That's when France signed a treaty with the Arab League for cultural
well, there's been those
exchange.
kinds of exchanges for some time, but I think the Islamo left in the form that we currently have it, in the form that we see on the streets of our cities every weekend, that, in my view, is the Islamo left. That's really from the past 20 or 30 years, because what happens, I think, after the end of the Cold War, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have the impact that then has across the Western world, which it throws the left into kind of moral crisis, because they no longer have, some of them were pro-Soviet Union, some of them were critical of the Soviet Union, whatever.
They can't claim it's an economic project anymore,
well,
at least. And they really couldn't, even before 1917, because anyone who can count could tell them this is obviously not going to work. But
they could no longer point to the Soviet Union as an example of an alternative form of society.
Exactly.
Whether they approved of that society or disapproved. So it threw them into a sense of disarray. They had already turned against the Western working class. That had been taking place even before the 70s, from the 50s and the 60s. The counterculture was quite an anti-working class phenomenon. And that's the moment at which the left kind of went from talking about economic questions to cultural questions. It went from talking about how to improve the lot of the working man to talking about why is the working man so easily duped by advertising and culture? And so it shifted quite dramatically through the counterculture. The left went from being a class-based movement to being anti-working class. So that's been gathering pace for some time. It's exacerbated.
Well, they lost the class argument, Brendan.
Yeah.
Yes. So they had to resort to something, and all they had left was culture, which is basically what Nazi National Socialism in Germany is, take the socialist ideas in a corporativist system, and then you mix in a bit of racism or sexism or
but I
whatever.
think what happens what happens in the Western context then is that you have the changing of the left over a long period of time. With the end of the Cold War, it really intensifies. And they look for new constituencies. They look for new movements they might attach them to and themselves to. And one of the ones they decide to do that with is radical Islam. Yeah. And in fact, I talk about this in my book. There's a pamphlet published in Britain in 1994 called The Prophet and the Proletariat. The title gives a sense of what it's about. It's about when it might be appropriate for the left to offer solidarity to radical Islamist movements. And it's actually a pamphlet which, in today's age, it actually sounds quite sensible, because it says we have to remember that a lot of these movements are fascistic, they're anti-Semitic, they're misogynistic, but there might be times at which we can align with them in the fight against imperialism, which I think, by the way, is a deranged idea, completely deranged, that you would align with them on any issue. But at least there was an acknowledgement that they were backward, racist, regressive movements. That side of it has completely disappeared. Yeah. There's no willingness now whatsoever to talk about the backward nature of these groups. And instead, the Islamo left has the left in the West has jumped into bed with radical Islamists. We have Jeremy Corbyn in Britain who referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as his friends. We have people on the streets of London chanting, "We are all Hezbollah now." We have people making positive noises about Hamas and its active resistance on 7th of October. So what the modern left and these radical Islamists share in common is a violent hostility towards modernity itself. a violent hostility towards the idea of Western civilization. And they've aligned around that. And they've aligned around this revolt against civilization. And that's what both of them represent.
Yes, and if you look at all Western nations now, from Sweden to the States, with you in between and the continent, these leftists, our institutions are riddled with them. Academia, government institutions, and they're all they're all part of this ideology. So how do you change that?
I think you change it by. I think you're right that the institutions are now in the grip of a kind of. I think we've had this discussion before. I don't even think of it as leftism. It's so unrecognizable.
1 second, I'll make it even harder for you.
Go on.
Okay, so Pax Americana has fallen. We now live in a multipolar world. It's Game of Thrones, sort of. And the world will be divvied up again and lines redrawn. On top of this, as our enemies encroach, our leftists who rule most of our institutions in our societies have aligned with our enemies. How do you fix that?
You fix it by, well, there's two choices. One can either say we're fucked, so what's the point, and become nihilistic and dejected and fatalistic and depressed, which some people have done. I think that's a mistake. Or you can say, well, we need to cultivate a new culture of critical thinking. That's the far harder thing to do. And it takes a long time. It can take decades to build that kind of thing up. But it's definitely something worth doing. And I think people are starting to do it. Actually, in almost all Western societies, certainly the ones I'm familiar with, there are new movements of people who are thinking differently. There are new movements of people who are creating new media ecospheres in which different ideas can be expressed and the ideologies of our time can be challenged. Other people are taking to the streets. There's lots of protests now against the European Union, our governments who engage in mass immigration without discussing it with the public, without asking for what our democratic consent. There's protests against that. So that things are happening and of course, populism has not gone away. People are turning to populist parties or to populist ideas like Brexit as an expression of their contempt for this new class of people that rule over us, as you've just aptly described them. So things are happening and it is possible to turn the tide. It's just hard work. It takes time. It's very difficult. It's intellectually difficult and it's practically difficult.
Yes, sounds like it. I was just going to hand out free beepers to leftists.
Well, I don't think we're at that stage yet, but we might well get there. It's never a lost cause. There have been, the way I see it, and this probably will sound depressing, there have been far darker moments in human history. There really have been. I mean, I know society can sometimes seem a bit shit at the moment because we're ruled by people who either don't know what they're doing or do know what they're doing and what they're doing is awful. So it can feel dispiriting. And I know a lot of people do feel dispirited, but there have been far darker moments in history. The midnight in the century of the Holocaust, for example, that was far worse than what we have now. Or you go back to the medieval era when people were in the grip of all forms of hysteria. And if their crop failed, they would go down the road and kill the old woman. That was a form of hysteria that is worse than what we have now. Although I think
in most cases, their crops came back after that. So.
Yeah. So it worked. So yeah. So there have been far darker moments and we came through it actually stronger than ever. So I think it is always worth bearing that in mind, not to be Pollyanna-ish about it or overly optimistic or naive about the challenges we face, but just to remind ourselves that humanity both has the capacity to do stupid shit, and we've seen that over the past 30 years with the rise of these new ideologues into positions of power and their crazy ideas. But we also have the capacity to overturn that stuff and to move in a more positive direction and to win to our side sensible, ordinary people. And I don't think we should forget that.
That sounds quite hopeful.
Well, I'm quite a hopeful person. And, the thing is, I think that it's one of the problems we face today is that the crazy people are the noisiest people. So, and they're facilitated in some ways by the media establishment. So if you look at the protests, right, after 7th of October, I think they were, Suella Braverman, our former Home Secretary, referred to them as hate marches. I agree with her. I think they were hate marches. I think, and, a lot of the middle class, kind of well-to-do people who went on the marches in London, they would say, no, we were just there to express our support for the people of Gaza. Now, I'm sorry, if you're marching shoulder to shoulder with radical Islamists calling for holy war against the Jewish state, i.e. another pogrom, and people chanting about the army of Muhammad coming back to kill Jews, and people wearing Hamas paraphernalia, then that's on you. If I went on a march every weekend and there were white supremacists on it holding up nooses or saying, let's get an army together and kill loads of black people, I'd stop going on those marches. You have to have a level of self-awareness. So they are hate marches, but the thing to bear in mind, I think, is that this is, even though they're loud and they get a lot of coverage because the media establishment sympathizes with their crazy ideas, this is not the majority of society. In fact, very often it is precisely as we've just been talking about. It's an alliance, I think a mistaken alliance between affluent so-called socialists and radical Islamists or radicalized young Muslims. But they are minorities within their own communities. And that's the thing that it's worth bearing in mind.
Yes, but here's the thing. So Sweden is a way more conformist society than England is. I mean, it's not even a competition. And especially if you look at media and culture, because we have our subsidies are so huge to press, and we have such a big public service that is completely financed by the government. But what were we talking about? Sorry, I lost.
I was saying that these crazy people are a minority, so we shouldn't.
Yeah, so we have a sort of a famous Nepo baby leftist artist, and she has on her social media been spreading anti-Semitic, like overtly anti-Semitic lies. She's not Arab; she's Swedish, ethnically Swedish. She has no connection to the conflict in the Middle East whatsoever. She's been spreading the most vile, Israel killed their own, to start a genocide against Gaza and all that shit. Israelis are stealing organs systematically from young Palestinian children, everything. And this gets out into media because she has a following of 300,000, which in a country this small is quite a large following. But they have already recorded this TV show with her where she's supposed to paint other celebrities naked while interviewing them about themselves. And this leads to a storm, of course. And Swedish public television claims that she has apologized, which she did not, and also continued to spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But the thing is, you can tell from the way that our public service defended her. She got cancelled eventually from, the outrage. But you could tell the way they defended her that they agree with her in essence. Maybe she was wrong about Israeli army helicopters killing people at the Nova Festival, but in essence, they let the massacre happen some way. And I mean, Stina is not an Arab. She's grown up here in Sweden with Swedish state television and Swedish state-subsidized media. And they have, for decades, her entire life, in fact, gradually become more overtly anti-Semitic in their description of Israel and its relationship to the Arab states and the Palestinian population.
Yeah.
So she's grown up in this water.
Yeah.
You understand? She's a minority. Sure, she's loud, but she has a following of 300,000. I'm not saying everyone who follows her is a die-hard fan who believes every word she says. I don't think so. But in essence, she is a product of social democratic Sweden, the first Western nation who admitted Arafat into the fold of Western nations, who actually, in essence, helped turn the tide in the West from against the Arabs to the pro-Soviet Palestinian cause. So
yeah, this is don't get me wrong. This is a very large and menacing and influential group of people. So I'm not saying it's just a handful of people and we don't have to worry about it. I'm definitely not saying that. What I am saying is that I think there is a groundswell of opinion out there that doesn't get expressed very often, largely because the public service media and the mainstream media more broadly doesn't want to hear from those people. They have contempt for them. And in fact, when they do speak up, for example, by voting for Brexit or by marching against whatever, they're damned as racist and xenophobes and idiots and whatever. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that this kind of supposedly pro-Palestine movement, which is really just an anti-Semitic movement, in my view, or certainly an unhinged Israelophobic movement, I'm not saying that it's tiny, and I'm not saying that it's insignificant and we don't have to fret about it too much. What I'm saying is that the reason it's now so influential, and it is because other strains of opinion are slightly on the back foot or are on the outside of discussion. So people like you and I are outsiders. Now, we have some clout and we can sometimes punch above our weight and we can sometimes win an audience. Great.
I'm very slim. I always punch above my weight.
Yeah, but we're outsiders.
Yes.
But the thing, so I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but what I am saying is that don't mistake the noisiness of these people for their uncritical domination of how people think. They are noisy and they are influential, there's no doubt, but there are other voices out there that are just either suppressed or ignored or written off. And it's those people I'm interested in. I want to know what they think. And I know that when I speak to people around the UK, I know that they think the anti-Israel marches were really annoying, that they shouldn't have taken place every weekend. They cost the police too much money. They made their point. Now they can just go back home. They don't have to keep doing it. There was that sentiment I heard again and again. But the BBC doesn't report on that because it doesn't care about those people. The pro-Palestine lobby doesn't engage with it because they don't care about those people. They think they're all racist stooges. So they're out there, but no one's talking to them. So I think we've got two choices. We can either throw our hands in the air and say, well, for God's sake, these new ideologues have won and they rule everything and let's just give it up. Or we can say, let's talk to other people. Let's engage with other people. Let's create content for other people. Let's try over time to create a new way of thinking that might challenge this way of thinking. So that's really what I would suggest.
All right. That's nice. Before you leave me, because that's what will happen, your Conservative Party has just elected a new party leader. They ousted Rishi Sunak because obviously it's a racist party and he's brown. And they voted in who?
Kemi Badenoch.
I don't know her. Who's she?
She is black. She's a black woman. She's 44 years old. She's a member of parliament. She was a minister in Rishi's government. And she's really good. She's, I think, one of the most positive things that's happened in British politics for a long time. She is very willing to fight the culture war. She doesn't shirk from the culture war, the kind of culture war that I've just been suggesting in my own way. She knows what a woman is, which makes her instantly more impressive than Keir Starmer, who doesn't know what a woman is. She defends freedom of speech. She defends the vote for Brexit. She defends Israel. She said we should never be on the side of Hamas or Hezbollah, and we must recognize they are the bad guys. It's good to hear the word bad guys every now and then. And she is willing to stand up for scientific truth, biological reality, and old style conservative values. Not all of them are my values, but she's at least willing to do that, whereas other members of the party aren't. So I think she's. I describe her in a recent piece I wrote as the anti-Kamala. So where Kamala Harris is woke and declares her pronouns and is increasingly antsy about Israel and goes with the wind of the cultural establishment, Kemi Badenoch is the opposite of that. She's willing to stand up to the wind of the establishment. She's willing to push back against them. and she's willing to say what's right, even if she becomes unpopular in the media elites as a consequence. So it's a good thing. It's a positive thing. Will she fight the culture war as firmly as is necessary? I don't know. We have to wait and see. But I do think it's a positive development, and it's another reason to take heart, even in these pretty dark times.
Those are good final words, Brendan. Thank you once again for visiting Deconstructive Criticism.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Deconstructive Criticism. You can find Brendan O'Neill's book After the Pogrom online, and I would imagine in well-sorted bookstores. And you can find Brendan O'Neill's other writings in Spiked Online, The Spectator, The New York Post, etc., etc. I am Aaron Flam. Until next, have a good unit of time.